Good morning and welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. My name is Jack, and today we are going to be going over staff. So this is going to be the all-in-one staff video. So there's going to be some stuff that you're going to know already if you've already played through the tutorial. There's going to be stuff that you might only know if you've been a long-time vet and you've fully explored all the different things. And my goal is to try and explain everything that there is to do with staff, break it up into chapters, and then that way, if you ever have any questions about what staff are capable of, or what your staff are actually doing on the ground, this is sort of your all-in-one resource. But that being said, this video is going to be big, and so I'm going to strongly encourage you to use the chapter tool, because otherwise this is going to be a bit of a nightmare, and it might be a bit dry in places depending on your level of expertise in this game already. Normally when I make these tutorials, I'm expecting that you've picked up the game today and you're just now learning how to play. But there might be some stuff in here that, even if you've been playing for a long time, you might not know. So hopefully it is useful to everybody. But that being said, let's go ahead and talk about staff. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the staff buildings, because they're sort of their own separate category, and then we will get started with the staff specifically. We'll talk about which buildings they use and what their individual, specialty items are that they tend to interact with the most. So we're going to start all the way at the very end over here. We're going to start with our trade center. I know the workshop's over there. Don't worry about it. I didn't put these in any order. So we're going to start with our trade center. So there is only one version of the trade center in game. It is a 4 meter by 4 meter box, and this item will hold up to 200 animals. The majority of your interactions with the trade center are going to be through your animal trade button and through your exhibit trading button. So these are going to be how you actually interact with this object, not through the object itself. Now that being said, you do have action buttons over here to open animal storage and exhibit animal storage. These, I think, are redundancies, just in case either you don't realize that these buttons are here, or in case for whatever reason you're having a screen glitch and these aren't working and you don't want to restart your game. Those are the two main reasons I can see for wanting to come over here and actually click these buttons. But, of course, maybe that's just part of your playstyle. Next to it, we have two buttons that are pretty standard across all buildings, so we won't cover them after this. We have the Learn More button, which simply opens your help tool. And we have the Create New Work Zone button, which creates work zones. Work zones will be in their own section, so we're not going to talk about that right now. After that, in the scenery rating area, we have a couple of items that are going to be additions that all of these buildings have and that you are going to want to interact with. First one is your scenery. So this is the appeal of nature and construction items around this facility. We've already talked about building appeal on this tutorial series. If you'd like to learn more, I recommend that you go to our second tutorial on this playlist. It's going to be the one about building small buildings and getting started with decorating. It'll be the one that comes after the widget tool. Related to this is the reduced negative area. Again, this is something we've already talked about on a previous video. There is an area for negative impact on guests. I'm not entirely sure why it's not showing it right now, but generally there's a big red circle, and it will show where your guests are going to be negatively impacted by seeing this building. And this is going to be true, again, for all of your staff buildings. Your staff do not want to see these items, so the best thing to do is to decorate them well enough that their area is reduced, and then you can have these even on paths sometimes and the guests won't notice. Lastly, negative area. This shows the radius that the item is negatively impacted by. So right now, it says 0 out of 8. Let me double check real quick. It might be because I have creative preset. Let's apply the default. There we go. Yes, so now you can see this negative area of effect. So 8 meters is how much area this circle is taking up. You want to reduce this as far as possible. So the trade center, again, is going to be how you're going to get all of your different animals into the zoo. But there are only certain types of staff that can actually bring animals from the trade center to a enclosure or exhibit. They're going to be your veterinarian and your caretaker. Next, let's go ahead and talk about your keeper huts. There are two kinds in this game. There is the keeper hut small. This is the one that you start off with. They can only hold one person at a time. So if you are really intent on setting up your work zones in such a way that every habitat has its own keeper hut, which is a practice I do recommend but I don't do very often, you're going to need a lot of these. It tells the number of meals served in the lifetime, it tells the capacity. So if you don't have work zones set up, or if you are just a curious kind of person, this tells you what the efficiency is. Now this efficiency right here is actually telling you how much of the time this building spends in use. So in order to be 100% efficient, this item needs to be used all the time. This is not a useful metric to determining the actual efficiency of any of your staff buildings. They should be considered inefficient. Next over here we have the Keeper Hut Large. This one is special because it's a 8 by 8 meter block. So it's going to take up roughly 4 squares on your construction grid items. But it also holds 6 keepers. So if you have an area like, say, an African safari habitat, or if you have like a network of habitats all smushed together, and you don't want to spend a lot of area building for your staff, I do recommend getting a Keeper Hut Large. It will be something that you need to research in franchise mode and challenge mode. But it can be worth it, because you can have multiple keepers use this one building, and you don't run into issues where staff have too little room. It also tells you which staff are associated with the building, and which habitats it served last year. These things should already be known to you if you set up your work zones properly. However, it can be interesting information just in case you're curious about where these things are being allocated, or if you're stepping into a different or new zoo for the first time. Next is the vet facility. There's only one. There is no larger option for the vet facility, and it only services one animal at a time. So this building, you are going to need quite a lot of them, and they are expensive. And the only times that I recommend that you buying an extra one is if you are creating a new work zone that is significantly farther away from your original setup. It's easier for the vets to be able to take the ill or injured animals directly to the nearest vet facility than it is for them to run all the way across the park. That's an efficiency thing. So you are going to need to buy multiple of these depending on the size of your zoo. That being said, you should only need one at a time, and you should be using your quarantine, which we talk about in a little bit here, for holding all of your sick and injured animals until they can be treated by a vet. They also have a rather large negative area of impact at 12, so you will definitely want to reduce that as much as possible, or keep these away from guests. Next up, we have the staff facilities, and these are a little bit more involved. So they have a moderately large negative area of effect at 9 meters. The baseline staff facility holds 4 staff, whereas the large holds 12 staff. So it's absolutely worth the upgrade, especially if you know that you have some kind of food court or other large area where you're going to have a lot of staff visiting frequently. This is absolutely worth the upgrade. For both the staff facilities, both the small and the large, you have this tab up here called your perks. And this is very useful. I recommend playing around with this a little bit. Any staff that are assigned to this facility, or that happen to use this facility, will receive one of these different buffs. First one, which I find to be the most useful, is staff healthcare. Staff will be more resilient to being overworked. Next is social club. Staff members with this perk gain happiness faster. The only time that I can see needing this particular perk is if you are on one of the Myers maps for career mode, and you are looking to try and increase your staff happiness without increasing their wages too far. This is a really good one for that. Otherwise, I find this to be relatively useless. You should have enough money to be able to pay your staff accordingly. Next is learning resources. This allows your staff to receive training bonuses faster. This is excellent, especially in the early to mid-game when you're just starting off in franchise, and you need to get your staff trained up quickly and you don't want to wait a very long time. This is a great time to use this button. However, once your zoo is mostly built up and you have all of the areas that you want, you're probably going to want to swap this out for something else. Next, we have the security office. This is going to be specific for your security guards. None of your other staff are going to gain a bonus from this, so I recommend that you find a way to make a work zone for your security guards, so that way they receive this bonus. With this, your security guards will have better detection rates and ranges, so this is a massive boost to security in case you're dealing with a lot of crime. Next up is the staff PR course. Vendors with this perk will make the guests they interact with even happier. So this is really good specifically for vendors. Again, this is a rather specific one. But it is rather handy in case you have a staff area that's specifically linked to something like a food court, where you want all of those staff to gain a better bonus, so that way you can increase your guest rating. Lastly is the rec room. Staff resting here will recover energy slightly faster. So this one, as well as staff healthcare, I find to be the most useful. If you're curious or wondering just which ones you should pick, those are the two that I recommend. This one causes your staff to be ready for work much quicker, and so you don't spend a lot of time waiting for, say, your vendors to come back from break, or waiting for a veterinarian to rest up before they treat injured animals. You probably won't need this on easy mode very often, but once you get to hard mode, this can be very useful. Next, we have two different sizes of quarantine. So there is the baseline quarantine. This is a 4x4 meter box similar to the veterinary clinic, and it holds up to 8 animals. This is usually enough for your early game or for situations where you're quarantining animals that you're just bringing into the zoo. However, if your zoo is prone to outbreaks, say for example you have animals like flamingos, wildebeest, other hoofstock, peacocks, those sorts of animals where their habitats tend to get dirty very quickly and diseases tend to outbreak very quickly as well, it's worth then investing in a large quarantine facility where you can hold up to 24 animals. These do not have any kind of negative area of effect, at least on my version, but this may be different in other modes. Lastly, we have the 2 research items. So this one is specific for your vets. This is your research facility center small, and this is your large. The difference is that the small only holds up to 1 vet at a time, whereas the large holds up to 6. These are excellent for beginning your zoo's research, which you're going to find in your zoo tab, and then over here. There will be research available for all of the animals that you have in your zoo currently, unless you are in sandbox mode, at which point you have access to all of them, all the time, which is where I'm at right now. And at the bottom, you have all of your diseases. It is worth researching diseases quickly, especially if you have a specific habitat or your zoo is just prone to disease outbreaks. This helps with the detection, diagnosis, and the treatment. So it is worth it to invest in this, and they don't take a very long time. Lastly, we have the mechanic research over here. There is only one version of this in the game, sadly. I would like to have a larger one. Unfortunately, that's not the case. This holds up to 1 mechanic at a time, and its primary usage is for your mechanic research reached through the tab just underneath vet research. In here you have a whole bunch of sections. I roughly break these down into 2. There is the management research items, and there is the building research items. So a building research item is going to be something like the Oceania theme. If you want to build your own sets, then you only need to research up to rank 1. Everything after that is blueprints, and this holds true for all of your building sections here. So Africa, Australia, East Asia, this is going to be true for all of them. For your management ones, you're going to have things like the barriers, your drink shops, food shops, habitats, power sources, shelters and climbing, transport rides, staff facilities, and souvenir shops. If you want to unlock the larger items, you will need to research staff facilities. Each one opens up a new large item. Alright, now let's talk about the staff who actually use these buildings. First off, we have your veterinarian. So your veterinarian does a specific handful of jobs. Right now mine is currently carrying around a wallaby. Don't worry about that. I'm sure it'll be fine. So your vet is going to do a handful of things. The first thing that they're going to do is anytime that you bring in a new animal to your zoo, they're going to be the ones who move it from the trade center to the quarantine, from the quarantine into a habitat, or from a habitat or quarantine into the vet clinic, and then back again. So these are one of the only staff who actually handle the animals and deliver them to the locations that they need to be delivered to. When on regular duty, they're going to use this vet facility, and when they do, this is actually one of the many furnished buildings in case that's something that you want to build into your own personal tour area. Your guests won't appreciate it, but other members of the community might. When they do so, they will lay an animal right here, or if it's large enough, they will move this bed out of the way and lay the animal in this sectioned off area, at which point you can see them treat the animal and then return it to their habitat. The trade center does not have anything in it. However, their next task The research area does. So when you set a veterinarian to research, they're going to come into this building and they're going to choose one of these little stalls here with a computer, and they will sit at that computer and they will do their research. Their average day-to-day work tends to consist of going back and forth between different habitats, specifically the ones that they're assigned through your work zones, but if they're unassigned, they will go to whatever habitat has not seen a vet most recently. So they will bop between all the different habitats. They do not interact with your exhibits. Your exhibit animals do not get sick, and they do not need somebody to transport them into these items. So your vets only interact with the habitats. Next, let's talk about the other staff member who actually does deliver animals to different locations. This is going to be your caretaker. So the primary job of your caretaker is to wander around the paths of your zoo, and they're going to clean all of the guest-facing items that don't involve things like your different vendors. So this is going to be your picnic benches, your regular benches, and your bins. And the primary thing that they're going to be spending most of their time on is cleaning these bins. When they're not doing that, they are transporting animals to and from habitats, quarantines, and the trade center, but they will not necessarily deliver animals to the veterinary clinic because they can't treat them. Next, let's talk about the keeper. So the keeper is arguably one of your most busy members of staff. Their route is that they have a specific set of habitats that you will assign them to, or they will go to whichever habitat has alerts for animal needs. This could be hunger, thirst, or cleanliness. So that staff member will arrive at the habitat, at which point they will go in and they will do a preliminary check. From here, they will determine whether or not they only need to clean or if they need to feed and clean. Generally, they need to both feed and clean, at which point they will then travel over to the keeper hut, which again is a fully furnished building. This is the large keeper hut, as you can see in here. So they will prepare the animals' food, at which point they will then run back, and they will fill all of the enrichment items first, and then the regular food trough second. And lastly, if they don't have access to a food trough, or if the food trough is full for the number of animals that you have and you need extras, they will simply dump the food on the ground near the entrance. Only at that point will they go through and actually vacuum up all the poop. This is worth noting because if you have a large number of animals in a habitat and they're pooping constantly, you're going to need your keeper to visit frequently, and you're going to need to expect them to clean up the poop constantly. Sometimes it can be worth it to have multiple keepers assigned and have them on their own rotating schedules. Through here you have the call staff options, keeper, vet, and mechanic. You have cleanliness and barrier status. And if you go over here to maintenance, the last tab, you can set your vet frequency, your keeper frequency, and your mechanic frequency. For large, busy habitats, I recommend that you keep it at every month. There are very few times when you're going to want to increase it to every 3 or 6 months. And the only time that you want to set it to never is if you're playing in sandbox mode and you have welfare turned off. Likewise, your vet can also visit a habitat never, every month, 3 months, and 6 months. But your vet should only need to visit a habitat relatively infrequently throughout the year, unless they are specifically housing animals like the peacocks and the wildebeest and things like that we mentioned, where they're a disease risk and you want a veterinarian to keep on track of any sort of outbreaks as soon as possible. In that case, I would recommend increasing your vet frequency. Because your keepers follow the exact same route every single time, I do recommend keeping a keeper hut nearest to the habitat that it's going to be servicing, or building a network of habitats with a keeper center relatively near all of them. So that's something to consider for your zoo design. Next, let's talk about your mechanic. So your mechanic's workload is variable, and it depends on what you have in the zoo. If you are using barriers in any of your zoos, then your mechanic's primary job is going to be to fix these barriers. These will eventually wear down, at which point your mechanic will come in, sit right here, fix up the barrier, and leave. And they will do this for all of the habitats that they're assigned to. Or if they don't have any work zone, they will go to whatever barrier has the most dilapidation. The way that you can avoid having your mechanic focus on habitats most of the day is by going into your barrier items and using the null barriers. These specifically have no maintenance requirement, and so you can turn your maintenance settings to never. This is the situation where I would recommend doing that. Otherwise, your barrier dilapidation is going to be variable based on the barrier that you place down. So you may want to adjust how frequently a mechanic comes in based on whether or not your barrier dilapidates faster or slower. So your mechanics have a specific list of things that they will attend to, which you can view through their employment tab. And here are the tasks that they have. This also holds true for other members of staff. For example, your vet has specific things that they will attend to that you can toggle per the specific vet that you're working with. This is also true of virtually all other members of staff. For your mechanic specifically, you have a number of different tasks through here. One of them is the repair facility, the ride inspections, vending machine inspections, habitat repair wall, ride breakdowns, conduct mechanic research. In my experience, however, the only things that they actually end up fixing beyond the habitat barriers, which we talked about already, are going to be these items through here. Your water regulators, your power sources, and your vending machines. While it does have options in order to be able to do inspections on your kiosks through here, and your rides, I have never run into issues where either of these actually require a mechanic to attend to them. They may do inspections and pass through them, but for the most part, if you don't include these into your work zone, you will receive no ill effects. There's no dilapidation available on them, and likewise with your ride, though it's possible that they can break down over time, I have never run into this. Now this may be that I just don't use rides very often, and therefore have never seen them break down. It's possible that the mechanic does affect these. However, for the most part, it appears that a lot of these are functionally redundant options. The main things that they do are tend to your habitats, tend to these buildings right through here, and do research. Next, you have your 3 power sources. So you have your solar panel. This one is very useful if you need power in a small location where guests frequent, but that you don't want any kind of negative impact on. These have no negative impact on your guests. However, the radius that they serve is fairly small. Next up in radius, you have your wind turbine. So long as the top of your wind turbine is not covered, it will be operational, so that's something to keep in mind. It serves a medium-sized area. It's not terribly prone to breaking down, and it does count as conservation friendly, which can offer bonuses, but for the most part that information is only useful if you're working in career mode. It does have a negative area. For some reason mine is not showing. I don't know if it's because of my sandbox settings. But generally there is a negative area associated with these items, but it's not as big as the transformer. The transformer services the largest area. It's available immediately when you start your zoo. These other 2 need to be researched. But it does have a large negative area impact. Once again, for some reason it's not showing the negative area for me. Again, this is probably because of sandbox mode. These are not conservation friendly. However, out of the 3, you're probably going to want to use the transformer and the solar panel the most, simply because this one can be used near guests, and this one provides a ridiculous amount of power. The wind turbine is rather niche, and so I don't recommend it very often. Your water treatment facility is part of the base game, and it has a certain effective area range, and as the maintenance goes down, so too will the effective area be affected. Other than that, you cannot change the radius with which this cleans a specific area. However, there is also a second item through here, and if you haven't played the game in a very long time, for example, you came in at the very start and then haven't played since, this item might possibly be new to you. This is the water temperature regulator. And what this does is it alters the temperature of the water for a specific area. So you already have in your habitat section things like your heaters and coolers. These only affect airspace. So when you place down a heater or cooler, they're only going to affect an ambient airspace area. If you want to affect the water's temperature, you will need one of these. Through this, you can adjust your temperature settings, and you can also adjust the range, which we can pull up through here. If we go up to water, and then water temperature regulator, we can adjust the range through this slider here to make it smaller or wider. This is very handy if you only want it for specific habitats. For example, if you have a penguin enclosure in a hot zoo, or if you have something like the capybaras or the macaques who like to have hot springs area, these are the items that you want to use in order to achieve those variable temperatures. If you're playing in something like a tundra zoo, you may need this much more frequently because a lot of the animals available in-game will prefer their temperatures to be about 68 degrees or higher. You can find this in your natural habitat area. The temperature requirement applies for both water and on land. So if you find that you're running into issues where your animals are too cold when they enter their water, you will also want to use one of these. Next, let's talk about your vendor. So this is the staff member that you're going to be hiring both the most and the least. You usually will not need to hire extra vendors out of the staff tab through here, unless you are specifically running into issues where your staff are frequently on breaks and you need somebody to cover their shifts. At that point, I recommend hiring extra vendors. Your vendors are only going to service these kinds of buildings. So the guest kiosk box for your food, drink, information, and merchandising. And then of course the small stands that were added in the European free update and then in further updates since then. Generally, when you have vendors in your zoo, while you can associate them with specific work zones, you can also associate them with specific shops using this button right here. This allows you to select a particular shop and then confirm it, and then it will appear on their work zone. You can also move them to no work zone. Generally, I recommend not associating your staff with any particular building. I want them to fill whatever is currently not being used, and I'm not particularly concerned about whether or not one specific building has an associated vendor. That's a level of micromanagement I don't bother with. And generally, I prefer to have multiple vendors who can then come in and fill each other's shifts. While this member of staff right here is technically a vendor, the rides have their own system, and so you do not need to hire a vendor for this item. Likewise, this member of staff is glued to these items. They do not take rests, they do not close, and they don't leave their post. So you do not need to hire a vendor for this position. The game will automatically provide you one. Likewise, when you put down any of the guest-facing facilities like foods, drinks, or merchandising, the game will automatically hire a vendor to tend to that item. Next, let's talk about your security guard. So your security guard is only one of a larger piece of security management. Your security guard is going to be the NPC who actually roams through all of your different streets, and whenever they come across a pickpocket or a vandal, they will be the ones to chase that individual and eject them from the zoo, and then return money to any of the pickpocket's victims. Generally, when you train your staff, the thing that you're looking for is that they're able to work longer and more efficiently. With the security guard, things are a little bit different. Training increases the possibility that they will actually detect that a crime has happened, and that they will be able to chase down that individual and retrieve whatever stolen goods they have. This is one member of staff who you're going to want to train up as quickly as possible, because otherwise their workload will say inefficient. And it doesn't matter how much crime you have in the zoo, it will be inefficient until they reach that max level of training, at which point they suddenly become good at their job. In order to augment your security guard and make them a little bit less useless, you need to make use of the camera items. So right here I have the small bracket attachable camera. This costs $10 and I strongly recommend it. And then over here you have the security pole. This is $150, and unless you're flush with cash, I wouldn't recommend it. If you go into your security and crime tab, you can see cameras and guards as their own section. This bubble right here belongs to my security guard, and this overlapping bubble right here belongs to my cameras. They're virtually identical. These are also area of effect items. So for example, if you wanted to, you can hide your security cameras underground, and it will continue to affect the area even though you can't see them. These items watch your guests for any potential crimes. There's two in the game currently. We have pickpocketers and we have vandalism. Pickpocketers spawn in groups of one, so even though this is a situation where you will have groups of one individual enter the zoo, and of those, only a small percentage are actually criminals. So it's important that you don't get those mistaken and eject random single visitors from your zoo thinking that they might be potential criminals. That will get you a negative. In your zoo tab, all the way at zoo overview, you can find your crime tab. This tells you the number of pickpocketing victims currently in the zoo, the number last year, the number of pickpockets chased and caught, so this informs you of your security guard's efficiency. Innocent groups ejected. This will only occur if you are the one who are ejecting specific groups from the zoo. Over here you have the items for your vandalized objects, how many occurred last year, and the replacement costs. Unlike pickpocketing, vandalism only occurs when guest needs are low and they decide to vent on the local furniture. Replaceable objects in zoo simply tells you how many items are potential sources of vandalism, and security cameras tells you how large your network is. The security cameras feed information to your security guards, who will then show up at that location and execute on whatever task they need to do. There are other items that fit into your security network that are not specifically associated with a security guard. The first one is the Do Not Disturb sign. This is especially useful for shy animals who are sensitive to noise. The second one is the Do Not Feed sign. I find that I use this a lot less, but it can be useful if you have food kiosks near a habitat and you find that your animals are frequently getting sick. What may be happening is that your guests are throwing food into the habitat and it's making your animals sick, and this is a situation where you would pull out the Do Not Feed sign. However, in my last 3 years of playing, I've never needed to use this. Next we have curbs. These are for crowd control. The smallest one is going to be your guest barrier curb. This one tells your guests, do not pass into this area unless you absolutely must. So in cases of high crowding, they might use a guest curb to traverse through an area that they otherwise wouldn't. The guest barrier metal and the guest barrier ribbon are nearly identical items. They both prevent guests from moving into an area, period. So your guests will treat these items as though they are walls. I find that the guest barrier ribbon is extremely good in case you have a building where the paths are connecting through. And there's nothing that you can do about it, but you want your guests to treat the doorways that you've created as actual doorways. This is a great way to do that. This guest barrier metal is better for blocking off areas of path, especially if you want to do some remodeling. Of course, another way to do that is to go into your paths and change them to staff paths. This will tell your guests to get off that section of path as quickly as possible at their soonest leisure. Lastly, we have the guest barrier signs 1 and 2. Currently, it is unclear if either of these do anything. Lastly, let's talk about your educator. This is the member of staff who has received the most amount of updates over the course of the game's lifetime. Initially, the educator's only job was to go to talk points and to give specific animal talks. This is your animal talk point. These need to be associated with some kind of path, and then they also need to be associated with a habitat. If the barrier is low enough, and a species is selected, it will then inform you whether or not your guest educator can throw food into the habitat. If they can, it will lure the animals over, which makes the animal talks just a little bit more engaging for the guests, so that way they can actually see the animals up close. For more dangerous animals, you may want to avoid this step and simply have it be inaccessible. This may also be true for larger animals like elephants, where your guests are going to be able to see them regardless. Associated with your guest education point, your little animal talk area, is this animal talk seating. If you want to have a specific auditorium for your educator to talk to your guests, these can be a great way to have a lot of guests in one area without crowding paths. I don't use them very often, but they are available to you. And there are some other customization tools that you might use. For example, there's railing that you might want to use for these stairs. Next up, your educator will interact with your exhibits. For example, in this tank I have an American bullfrog. While this feature is not available with all of your exhibit animals, depending on the possibility that they're poisonous, venomous, dangerous, etc., there is a short list of animals for whom your guest educator will come over. They will remove the animal from the tank, and they will show them to any guests who happen to be around. This can be a lot of fun to watch for yourself as well, and it gives a pretty decent education boost. Lastly, in the most recent edition, we have the tour point system. This allows your educators to give guided tours of your zoo. I've not played around with this very much, but if you have a network of habitats where you really want to give tours, or if you have sections where you think it would be cool to have a backstage tour area, you can use these points. When giving a tour, keep in mind that your guests will still be negatively affected by your staff facilities, so you'll still want to make sure that their radiuses are at their minimal. That way, any guests who are on a tour do not become negatively impacted. Education is a much larger system besides this. However, the educator is now a useful member of that system. When they have nothing else to do, they will wander around the zoo and they will just give general talks. Not about any particular animal, but it will boost your guests' education if they're close enough to actually stop and listen. So they can be very useful members of staff. So this is everything that you need to know about staff, specifically. Now let's talk about work zones. In order to access your work zones, you're going to go into staff, and you're going to go up to the Work Zones tab. You can create a new work zone through here, or by clicking on one of your staff buildings, or by clicking on one of your members of staff. For example, if I click on my mechanic, I can go into their employment area, I can go into their employment tab, and I can create a new work zone for them to be associated with, and I can enter the work zone manager. From here, I can also tell the mechanic which tasks I want them specifically to do. For example, ride inspections, vending machine inspections, which once again, these don't break down, but they can be useful. Repair habitat walls, ride breakdowns. They'll handle any ride breakdowns, as well as conduct mechanic research. You can toggle any of these items on or off in order to change their specific workload, and you can also adjust their current salary. For example, I usually set mine to the default. I see no reason to change it, but if you find yourself low on funds, you might begin to lower your guest's salary towards the red. If you are at that point where you need funds desperately and you need to reduce your staff salary, right here is where their happiness is going to start to hit the yellow. If you go any lower than this, your staff are going to be unhappy, and you will need to start using staff facility boosts in order to keep them from deciding to quit. However, keeping your staff just above this point is usually enough to make them happy, and you're not necessarily gaining a whole bunch of money back once you enter this area. It also shows your staff's training and their staff statistics. Mine idles because I don't really have a lot going on in this sandbox zoo, but you can see how efficient your staff is. If you see that your staff is idling in a properly set up zoo, it may be that you have an issue with your work zone. So let's talk about the work zone manager. First thing you're going to want to do is create a new work zone. Generally, I recommend having your keepers associated with 1 to 2 habitats, any nearby associated exhibits, and a staff building. So this is how I would set up my keepers. For veterinarians, I recommend having an associated staff building, up to 3 or 4 different habitats, and any veterinary research. One of the things that I do enjoy doing is lumping my vet research and my mechanic research into one work zone, associating one habitat and possibly one power source with them, and then setting all of those staff members who I hire into that work zone to research. It's a very quick way to pump through any kind of research tasks that you have, especially on franchise, but I recommend only doing that once you can afford to have staff who do nothing but research all day. Make sure that you have a solid profit margin before you do that. There are a couple of things that you do not want to do with your work zones. For example, any members of security, if you tag them only to a specific research, to a particular staff room facility, and associate that facility with one of the bonuses, for example, the security bonus, unfortunately what will end up happening if you don't include anything like power sources, habitats, and guest facilities into that group, is that your security guards will begin to idle. So while they'll gain this boost, they won't apply it. Likewise, your caretaker is free roaming, and they really don't need to be associated with any particular work zone. There's not much of a reason to do that. Lastly, for your mechanics, when you set up your work zones, I recommend that you specifically create work zones that include a specific area. So for example, including any of your power facility items, any of your vending machines, and generally one habitat. And this is to keep them from arguing that they don't have anything to service, as well as a staff room. Work zones are really up to the situation and the user. So these are sort of all of the different recommendations that I can give. However, if you would like, there is also a staff uniform customization. You can set this to specific vendors, you can use the default, you can apply to all staff type, and you can apply this to any newly hired staff as well. So if you have specific work zones and you want to associate them with specific colors, this is the tab for you. This is a small customization option. It's mostly for you, it doesn't affect your guests, but it can be useful as a kind of and-on. Alright, that is everything that you need to know about staff. I think we've covered everything through here. So, like I said, this might be a rather dry, rather boring video, but I hope that you learned something at least. Thank you for joining me, and happy building!